Today we are picking up with foundations of government. There are several different types of government. We're not going to get into all of them. By the time you're a senior, we'll get into more of the specific types of government, but we're just going to hit on some of the basics. The first is an absolute monarchy, and an absolute monarchy is where you have a king or a queen that holds the power. They are the only ones in charge. They're the only ones who get a say in anything. So that's the absolute part of it, where they're the only ones who have the power, and the monarchy is being a king or a queen. The second type of government is a dictatorship. And a dictatorship is where the power is held by force, usually with the backing of the military. And it can be held by one person, or it can be held by a whole group. So it kind of depends. But that's a dictatorship. The third is a democracy. And in a democracy, the people rule directly or they elect officials, but it's a government of the people. And there are two forms. You have a direct democracy, which is where everybody votes on everything. Everybody in the community votes. And that can be kind of a pain. Direct democracy hasn't always been very successful because it's hard to get people to want to go out and vote all the time on everything. When you think, in our Congress today, roughly 10,000 bills are introduced every year, which would translate to every citizen who's able to vote have to go out and vote on 300 bills every day of the year just to go through them all to decide if they want them or not. So it would take a lot of time. So that's why in the U.S. we have gone to a representative form of democracy. And in a representative form of democracy, you elect people who are going to do the work of government for you. So you don't have to go in and vote every day. They have that job. And they don't vote every day either. They just pick a few things to go through. So they narrow down that list of 10,000 to half that number right off the bat by saying, some of these are all the same or talking about the same thing, or they're not worth our time, or it's not something that would appeal to a lot of people. So that representative government, their job is to go in and do the work of government for us so we don't have to do that. Now, what is the purpose of government? Well, the purpose of government, there's four purposes. The first is that they help people to cooperate, to get them to work together, because it's easier to work together than to work alone. It's easier to get a task done. If you had to build a house all by yourself, it's going to take you forever. You may not know how to do everything, so you have to learn it and then go do it. Whereas if you have a bunch of people helping and working together to build that house, it's going to go a lot faster, and people are going to have their own expertise and be able to focus on one thing. So our government helps people to cooperate, so we can get things like protection and food and education and roads, all kinds of stuff. And the second purpose is that it provides services, and services can include things like schools, like education. It provides us with a monetary system, just having cash, money to spend. That's a service provided by the government. Having a travel system in terms of roads and boats and planes. That's services provided by the government. The third purpose of government is to provide rules. And this is just to help people behave, basically. The rules that we follow are laws, and laws are rules of conduct. How we should behave, how we should conduct ourselves. And that's rules of conduct for a group. Those are basically laid out for us in the Constitution. And the Constitution is just a basic plan, a written plan of our government. It gives us the framework. It doesn't necessarily give us the details. And that was probably a very smart thing that the founders of our government did, was that they didn't put a whole lot of detail into it. So it allowed us to expand it and to make it useful for us today, just as it was useful for them in 1776. Or 1787, I should say. The fourth purpose is to put it into practice. Putting those laws into practice, putting the services into practice, protecting our freedoms without violating other people's freedoms. So it's kind of a delicate balance to do that, but that's something that the government does. So when we look at the first American government was established, or the idea was born with the Declaration of Independence. And the Declaration of Independence, I hope you know this, was created July 4th, 1776. And it explains why the colonies, which were owned by the British, wanted to separate from Great Britain. And basically what the Declaration of Independence talks about is protecting human rights. And human rights are those rights to which all people are entitled. The right to freedom, right to equality, right to be treated equally and fairly. And so in your book on page 25, there's a little excerpt from the Declaration of Independence that I want you to memorize. You need to memorize, I should say. And it goes, we the people, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So it's 35 words long. It's something that you will need to memorize for the test, and we'll talk about it in class as to what that actually means, because on the test you'll also have to tell me what it means to you. Anyway, so we had the Declaration of Independence, and we have our Independence War, the Revolutionary War. Well, after the Revolutionary War, then we had to figure out, okay, what kind of government are we going to have? And our first government was called the Articles of Confederation. We were a confederation, and a confederation is just a loose association of states, just meaning that the states were all separate little countries that agreed to work together. Now, this can be a problem. Most confederations are not successful, and ours wasn't. There's several weaknesses to it. The Articles of Confederation didn't create a court system, so if you broke the law, there was nobody there to say how badly you broke it and how you should be punished. There were no taxes, which sounds like a good thing until you realize that taxes pay for a lot of our stuff, like roads and services and garbage removal and all that kind of stuff. So kind of need to have taxes. There was no national monetary system, so each of the colonies or each of the new states had their own separate currency that they were using, and it didn't work out very well. There were no officials to carry out the laws, so there's no president, there's no governor, there's none of that. In order to pass anything, to make changes to the articles, all of them had to agree to it, which is pretty difficult to do when these states don't like each other, and so some of them would just vote no just to make the other people mad. So that was a common problem. So when you look at the failures of the Articles of Confederation, there just was no power for the national government, for the Confederation. The states saw themselves as individual little countries. They never really saw themselves as being united as one. There was very little contact between the states. They really were very standoffish and didn't want to work together. And there was a lot of jealousy, a lot of fighting over borders and trade and money and all kinds of stuff. So it was just a very poor situation. So some very, very smart people in each of the states realized that this was a problem that they needed to deal with. And so the Constitutional Convention is going to come around. And the Constitutional Convention was made up of 55 delegates, and these delegates are representatives from each of the states, and they were sent to find ways to improve the national government. Now, they did not intend to change and get rid of completely the Articles of Confederation. They were just going to tweak it a little bit. But then they realized that it really was not working and there was no real solution to tweak it. So they decided that they needed to completely change the whole thing. And so we get a new constitution. Now, these delegates included famous people like George Washington, Ben Franklin, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton. Hopefully these are all names that are familiar to you. But what they're going to do, and they were very smart about it, they decided that they're going to look at a lot of different things from history and figure out, okay, what works and what doesn't work. So some of the documents that they're going to look at included things like the Magna Carta. And the Magna Carta was an English document from the 1200s. And this document from the 1200s in England guaranteed freedom of the people, that the rulers shouldn't be exempt from the people, that whatever laws were passed by the government, so let's say the king passes a tax, he also has to pay that tax. He doesn't get a buy from it. And so they really liked that idea that the government shouldn't be set aside. They shouldn't get special privileges. So they really like that idea from there. They also looked at the English Bill of Rights, which talked about right to fair punishment and the right to petition to get things changed. They really liked that concept. And then they also looked at the parliamentary government of Britain. Now, it seems kind of odd that they fought for independence from Britain, and here they're looking at all Britain's stuff. Well, the British was what they were familiar with, so that's what they're looking at. They looked at a lot of other things too, but the British were the ones that they were the most familiar with their material. They were able to see how it worked, did it work, and they were most familiar with that history. But from the parliamentary form of government, they really liked the idea of the bicameral or the two-house legislature, where you would have checks and balances, where one branch is going to become too powerful. They really like that idea. Now, these meetings are going to be held in secret in order to avoid anybody getting bribes and those kinds of things. They were able to speak freely. Eventually, the Constitution will be written, and the Constitution is going to have a federal system of power, where the power is divided between a national government and state governments. Now, a lot of things are accomplished by compromise, and a compromise is an agreement in which each side is going to give up part of its demands in order for them to come to a deal. Part of that is the Great Compromise, which creates our modern-day Congress, where one house was equal representation and the other was based on population. The smaller states wanted equal, the larger states wanted based on population. That was to each of their advantage, and they finally decided, well, let's have a little bit of both. The national government under the Constitution is going to have more power, which it did not have in the Articles of Confederation. It had the power to raise up an army, it had the power to tax, to regulate trade, to coin money, just a lot of things, a court system, the president, officials to carry out the government. So all kinds of stuff that was going to be beneficial. The next step after creating the Constitution was getting it approved. And the approval process is called ratification. It just means approval. So ratification is the approval of the Constitution. Now, it had to be ratified by 9 out of the 13 states. Not everybody agreed that this new government was the answer. So there were the Federalists who really liked the Constitution. They supported the Constitution. They liked the strong national government. They liked the weaker state governments. And then you had the Anti-Federalists who didn't like the Constitution. They wanted stronger state governments and a weaker national government. And so you had these two groups kind of fighting it out. And eventually the votes are taken. And a lot of the states are going to say, well, we will ratify this Constitution as long as you add a Bill of Rights, because not all the people's rights are enumerated or listed in the Constitution, and we just want to make sure that the government knows what our rights are. So that was agreed that would happen. New York will be chosen as the national capital. It's our first capital until Washington, D.C. is created, because Washington, D.C. was not there yet, so they actually had to build it. And George Washington will serve as our first president, and he is elected unanimously as the first president. And so that is how our government comes into being.